It's done.
What point do you want the lights off? Maybe once you said hello?
Yeah, exactly. Once I said good evening. Okay.
I'm just going to put this on.
Thank you.
As soon as you
Okay, hello, good evening, everyone. Key parts of Architecture Week is that we usually invite two practices to think with us about what it means to be an architect. One is almost always in the last few years a practice that is doing work somewhere on the continent, so that as South Africans we can understand what's happening architecturally elsewhere, but also an experimental practice that's thinking about how might we do practice differently. So this evening we have with us Glenn DeRoche from Deroche Projects based in Accra, Ghana. And tomorrow evening we will have with us Dr. Nenpin. So it gives me great pleasure and delight to introduce Glenn DeRoche, who has made time in his extremely busy schedule to come be with us. He's been reviewing for 2 days now, so I hope you're still standing, Glenn, ready to talk about the work.
Absolutely.
And perhaps it's time for the students to review you. And if I may introduce your practice, Deroche Projects is an Accra-based architecture and design practice that works globally to create innovative community-driven spaces. It's about a 15-year-old studio, and they work across the productive tension between digital exploration and hands-on making, high-tech precision and low-tech ingenuity, contemporary construction and indigenous building traditions. And they're very focused, and I think something that many of us are reaching for is what does it mean to practice in this context on this continent and develop our own understanding of what sustainability means. They've had a number of notable works and have exhibited internationally, including at the Venice Biennale. They have received the Wholesome Award for Sustainable Construction in 2023, the Architects Newspaper's Best of Design Award in 2024, the Africa International Design Awards in 2026, the Monocle Design Awards in 2026, and in 2025, their project, the Backyard Community Club, was recognized by Wallpaper magazine and is one of the top 10 architecture moments of the year. Welcome, Glenn.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for. Ooh, is it off? No? Okay. Thank you very much for that great introduction. Good evening to you all, and thank you for having me. Before I start, I want to acknowledge the team at Deroche Projects. The work I'm sharing today is the result of many people's thinking, testing, and making together. Deroche Projects is a studio based in Accra, Ghana, working internationally. For a long time, architectural exchange with Africa has largely been imagined in one direction. Expertise comes in and technology comes in. And at Deroche Projects, we're interested in reversing that direction. So these just represent a few places where we're currently working from our practice in Accra. We want to produce knowledge here, develop expertise here, and allow that knowledge to travel outward. Working globally for us means remaining deeply rooted in where we are while contributing to a much broader architectural conversation. To start, I wanted to start with a quote from Stuart Hall, who is a Jamaican-British scholar and culturalist. And he says that cultural identity, in this second sense, is a matter of becoming as well as being. It belongs to the future as much as to the past. And this is from his Cultural Identity and Diaspora essay from 1990. And while Hall is speaking about cultural identity, I think the same idea can be applied to material culture. They carry knowledge that can continue to evolve, and for us, future lineages begins there. It is a way of thinking about architecture through continuity and development, and we look at what already exists, how it was made, and what knowledge sits within it, and how that knowledge can be tested again under contemporary conditions. So the aim is not to reproduce tradition, but it's to understand, excuse me, the aim is not to reproduce traditions, but to understand it well enough to extend it. And in this lecture, I want to look at two architectural lineages, in particular, that of pozzolana concrete, which is a reduced carbon concrete material, and that of rammed earth, and how we're working with each through research, manufacturing, prototyping, and building. So that takes us to our first material. And this is just a collage of different images that comes from making pozzolana in Ghana. And Africa represents an interesting contradiction in the climate conversation. The continent has contributed less than 3% of total global and cumulative energy-related CO2 emissions, yet is already experiencing some of the most severe consequences of climate change. At the same time, it is a continent that still has an enormous amount of building to do. As architects practicing here, we cannot ignore what we know about environmental impact of cement and concrete. But neither can we imagine that an equitable transition means simply abandoning construction technologies, industries, skills, and supply chains available to us and replacing them overnight with systems that do not yet exist at the scale we need. So our question in examining this locally made material in Ghana has become more immediate. And it's how do we make the materials we already build with materially better? And that brought us to pozzolana as a locally sourced replacement for Portland cement. Just taking us through the notion of making pozzolana, it is a widely available material in Ghana. It comes from kaolin clay, which is the same type of clay that makes china, but this is more of the top surface clay material that is not good and pure enough for making china, and it exists in various regions of Ghana. The raw clay is then air dried or oven dried to remove excess moisture. Palm kernel shells, which is the byproduct of the palm kernel from making palm oil, is collected and ground into a fine powder that's used as its fuel source. The clay is then ground along with the PKS mixed in at 20%. The mixture is then fed through nodulizers made into small balls, and ultimately those small balls are then fired, crushed, and then sieved through a 200 mesh, approximately 0.075 of a millimeter. And the consistent particle is then sold as raw pozzolana. The primary benefits of pozzolana is that it has a low carbon footprint. It's waste valorization because it uses this waste clay from the top. It also uses this recycled material, palm kernel shells. It has a late age strength. It's reduced permeability, cost reductions. I mean, we've built with the material now for the last 5 years, and we can show and back this data from working with garnet standards authorities and then also through the bill of quantities of our projects. Traditional cement is typically made with clinker, and that clinker has additives which make cement, which then produces the CO2. Calcium clay cement is basically a reduced clinker, the additives, the calcium clay, and it can reduce the cement, the CO2 emissions up to 48%. So replacing 30 to 50% of Portland cement with locally produced calcium clay can reduce this embodied CO2 by approximately 20 to 45%. While maintaining its structural integrity. The first project that I'll take us through that uses this material is the Ogbajo Residency for Writers and Curators that was done in collaboration with a partner at the time. The project is set in the outskirts of Accra in a place that's rapidly urbanizing and used to actually be treated as farmland. So you have this really beautiful mix between farmland or urban grazing and a series of new rapid urbanization happening. That rapid urbanization is being built with very few or little regulations being followed. So people have, and our neighbors have built right up into our boundary walls, which sort of lends itself to the architectural response. You can see here in this picture our project in the distance, with this urban grazing happening just in the rear of our site. A few completed projects and then a few in-progress projects. But I really love this image because it speaks to that urbanization and this blur as Accra as a city continues to sprawl outwards. This is an adaptive reuse project. So the house, as we encountered it, is the image on the left. And I forgot I had this. The house we have is the image on the left. And then what we did was a bit of partial demolition to get rid of the elements which we determined wasn't necessary for the project. The project can be seen or understood through these 6 moves, which is really just understanding and testing the existing structure, removing irreplaceable building elements and leaking building elements, which obviously compromises the use. And third, reprogramming the ground floor, first floors, as the program requires for 3, 1 writer and 2 curators at the same time to occupy the space. We've then introduced new roofscapes throughout the project and then adorned the project with landscaping throughout. From the outside, the project is pretty nondescript. And that's intentional due to the matter of urban grazing, which also happens along the front of our road. However, when you come to the inside of the project, from enter, you have this large courtyard, this green space, which ultimately frames the front elevation of that adaptive reuse structure, and it shows this canopy which lines all along the outside. You would notice that the concrete of this project has a very particular color, and that's the color of using the calcium clay cement that we use. And because we can get almost a match, through the data we've received, we've lowered our carbon emissions by using this by 37% in this project. What you see is a canopy that's been inserted in and around the project. The canopy is treated as both a climate moderator, but also a privacy moderator. As you can see, the existing buildings in and around that we've come to inherit on this site built directly on our boundary. So in order for people to use some of the leisure spaces created like the pool or the courtyard, this canopy grows and shrinks accordingly to create privacy. So as you can see from this view, It's very hard to see those windows to the existing structure. However, you imagine the canopy removed, if we would have a direct view into the structure. Playing and framing light in this project is something that was very important to us. So this is a little axo or light well diagram. Again, as a lot of our neighbors have been built directly on the boundary, but this is ultimately what treated as a residency, a dwelling. We had to ensure that light, air, and all the other factors for suitable dwelling was maintained. So we had to look at bringing in light in different orientations and in indirect ways. There are obviously climate benefits to that, but also primarily what we're looking at doing is doing that in order to manage the light qualities inside the space. So we've punctured the roofscapes in a number of different ways, horizontal views out to various gardens. For instance, this large window pane that looks directly out to the courtyard that's anchored by a mango tree. We actively play with light in a lot of our projects and use light as an active participant in the design and the realization of our projects. So we can see here underneath the canopy, this foreground and this light being shaped within the courtyard. We can see additional punctures brought closer to the glazing to intentionally bring more light into this living room space. Again, light being framed over the pool, underneath the canopy from the pool lounge area. In some of the ancillary spaces, bringing in indirect light as a way of lighting, naturally lighting these spaces. In stairwells, and again, in some of the ancillary spaces, like the bathrooms, where we didn't have access to putting any windows for ventilation on the facade. This is just showing you an interior view as you enter into the property, how that light is framed around corners from above and from the foreground in these windows that frame views to very specific and themed gardens around the periphery. Again, this is an adaptive reuse project, so we really like speaking to a dialogue where we make a connection between the existing structure and the proposed or the new structure. And in making that dialogue and not to confuse the two, what we try and do is leave the existing structure completely raw and exposed, and then borrowing the language of these circular columns for the colonnade, which runs around and acts as the primary structural logic for this new extension. In the plan, a lot of the public spaces are located on the ground floor for the residents and the residents of this residency. So you have your living room, kitchen, gym, writing room, all of these public functions on the ground floor. They open up to the pool, they open up to the gardens as an extension and using the exterior as an extension of these public functions. And on the upper level, we basically have all of the ensuite rooms for the 3 residents, along with a meditation room, which we'll see in some of the latter slides. Again, bringing in that indirect light just behind us is actually a building. So putting a window here in the facade as a measure of bringing in light, obviously would also bring in a privacy invasion. So what we have are these solid walls with light coming in from above, which drops indirect light into the space, but also acts as a measure to mitigate heat gain within these interior spaces. We can also see here the courtyard space, which is on the upper level, treated as a meditation room for the residents. And you would see that in this, we have this kind of very textured facade. And that textured facade, something that we're not very interested in is mimicry and taking things as they are in their final product. And we're really fascinated with this idea and interest in the process of building throughout various stages. So working with earth, working with render quite frequently in our projects, we stumbled across this reference image that we thought was really beautiful of this in progress adobe house being built in Northern Africa. And you can see the various stages of the building where you have this kind of rough texture. And the way it's made is that you kind of ball the earth up, you throw it at the structure, you leave it to harden, you then smoothen it to this medium coarse texture before it gets to the final texture of this smooth finish that you see down below. And in looking at creating this smooth texture, what was more interesting to us was that starting process and working with these artisanal masons and making them very much a part of the collaboration of this project by artisanally sculpting this facade and treating it almost like a canvas by hand. And that's what lends itself to creating this dynamic facade, which is a sort of progress of building with earth. We can see it a bit more close up here and how some of these frame views to the neighboring contexts. And then the building from a slightly more zoomed out scale, showing the context of the structures being built directly on our boundary line. And the ones you can't see is also at the rear. And how this house fits in, or this residency fits into this rapidly urbanizing context. The second project I'd like to share is the Surf Ghana project, which is located in a very rural part of Ghana. This project is about 8 hours away from the capital city. And to put it into context, it's very minimal with the resources that go to building structures in this area. So pretty much every building is a collage of different tiles. They're all block work and rendered and painted buildings, which often fall to decay quite quickly due to the strength of the breeze that we get directly off the Atlantic Ocean. Again, it's another site. It's a very small footprint and intervention, but a very important one for the community of Buswa. As you can see, it sits directly on the Atlantic Ocean with a series of structures in a various series of states surrounding us and wedging us in. You can see that structure again here. This is the project. Our neighboring buildings built in very closely around us. And also, in some ways, we treated the two large ficus trees at the front of our site also as a constraint. So kind of building within these four constraints around us. Again, this is another adaptive reuse project. What we encountered was a single room that the surfers used to sleep in with a leaking roof, a toilet in the back. This was a kind of garden at the back that, due to the necessity of needing a toilet, they closed out and filled it with this raffia-lined toilet and dilapidated roof. What we did with the surfers, because we didn't have a big budget for the NGO, Surf Ghana, to do this project. So what we did was we completed the demolition and even some of the building with the community of surfers that were going to occupy the space. Something that we found very interesting about this is bringing in the occupants at the beginning of the project and making them a part of not just the design, but also the construction, lends itself to a certain level of stewardship and care for the building post-occupation. So even going back to the site now, it's quite beautiful to see how the surfers make sure that the space stays clean, pristine. We even get calls from them still when something breaks to have it replaced. As I said, it was a one-room structure that we inherited with this toilet at a rear garden. What we did was we kept that single one-room structure as it needed to be, as this is just a community hub for surfers. We kept the toilet towards the rear, except we put it in what we called an inhabited column. So everything you see in gray is structural, and it's anchored by this pillar at the top. And what we also did was we perforated the back wall, opened up the facade, so that from the Atlantic Ocean, we can get a strong crosswind breeze throughout the structure, because the project couldn't afford an AC, let alone even built-in fans. What we deemed this element that we plugged into this existing structure was the plug-in. The plug-in is classified by this inhabited column at the rear, which serves as their toilet. This one structural column at the front, which creates this extended porch over or covering to a porch at the front, which is now a really beautiful and dynamic community space. And in a series of folly columns, which allowed us to connect hammocks and use the top of this additional real estate as a kind of leisure space for the community. Again, simply breaking the project down into 4 moves, we looked at it as an adaptive reuse project where we removed the roof, inserted the plug-in, ensured that we had passive cooling throughout the project, so the sun hits this concrete platform, buffers it from its direct heat into the space. We looked at using, again, this low carbon concrete and then creating this extended roofscape at the top, which allowed the community to activate and basically increase the footprint of the project. So where we couldn't increase the footprint of the project to the left, back, left, or front, what we had to do was create this flat roof at the top in order to do that. So right now the community uses it for barbecues, stretching, observing the surf swells, etc. So it's quite beautiful. And we've been documenting how this is being used because it's actually a really beautiful post-occupation reality of the project. Again, showing it from the beachfront, taking into consideration how to preserve these two ficus trees and not tearing them down for the sake of creating this front porch. Showing the community using this front porch space, the surface of the community, both kids and adults that use it. Oops, sorry. Okay. And you would notice that in the project, we have this kind of reading texture of the architecture and of the concrete. And what is new in this project is actually more textured, and what is existing, we left this plastered and smooth. How we got to this was, again, being in a very resource-stricken part of Ghana, we couldn't afford to import formwork from the Accra capital city. So what we did was, this is a stilt village just near us, about 5 kilometers away from the site that we visited one time going. And we were really profound by their use of resourcefulness using the reeds, the raffia reeds, and this lightweight timber structure as a way of creating hospitals, schools, churches, and dwellings on their water community. And this community is called Inzulezu. But again, instead of mimicking the use of the raffia, we were rather inspired to use it as a kind of biodegradable formwork that we would make using very thin plywood that we can find in the community that's typically used for roofing sheets. So it's this reading that ultimately gives us this fluted texture on the concrete surface and allowed us to create a formwork that would naturally degrade back into the ground. Just a few views of that structure and this plugin and how it sits and floats above the existing one-room structure. Views through that through corridor for the cross ventilation. And again, this single room that's dynamically used for watching surf videos, watching surf competitions, used for surf training, and also just used by kids after school as the only place with Wi-Fi where they can come and do their homework and visit websites. And that takes us to the end of the 2 case studies using pozzolana, this low carbon concrete that we're utilizing in Ghana. The next 2 case studies that I'll take you through are using rammed earth. Rammed earth is a material that I've been obsessed with since graduate school, where I've traveled across much of North Africa and West Africa, surveying a series of adobe and earth structures. These are just a few images from that collection, but also a few inspirational images also that we found that serves its purpose in our studio and how we work with the material. Lateric soil is found based on the soil and conservation sustainability mapping. It's found in these various regions that you see in red, with Ghana sitting somewhere roughly here on the map. Typically, rammed earth is used in an in situ manner, where we have earth, gravel and sand, silt and water that's mixed and sieved, put inside a formwork. From that formwork, manual labor tampers this earth. The formwork is raised, and then you do finishing, and then you're there. This is how typically rammed earth is being used. However, this results in quite a bit of waste in formwork. Additionally, some of the disadvantages is that it's highly dependent on weather conditions. If any of you have ever built with the material. In Ghana, we face 2 very extreme rainy seasons, and in these rainy seasons, it makes working with this material practically impossible, further delaying the construction of any building that we propose, but also, and most importantly, hindering the commercial viability of using rammed earth in much larger developments. Increased duration for full project, as I just stated, skilled labor, you name it. Walls can cure in uncontrollable environments and not suited for large scale modularity in construction. So we became very interested in what happens if we augment using rammed earth in situ and really thinking about it as a series of precast modules. And we started researching this, and we just had to wait for the right project in order to put it into fruition. But in theory, the idea is that we can get earth from anywhere that has the right soil and clay content. We can transport that soil to any site or any controlled environment off-site of the project. We can build and design formwork that allows us to ram, create these prefabricated blocks, package the blocks for transportation, lift them into place using cranes, either mobile cranes or spider cranes, patching any blemishes through transportation, inhabiting a structure, and if built with no cement, and after its life cycle, bring it down and patch it back to where it belongs, or where the soil was taken, or any new site for that matter. So this is the kind of cyclical process of using rammed earth that we're absolutely fascinated with. We haven't gotten to yet using it without cement content. We're down to 3% cement in our rammed earth mixtures, but we are working on our first project where we're using lime instead of cement as our hardener in a beachfront property. And we're really hoping for positive results there, which are also prefabricated blocks. The first case study that came about maybe about a year or two after we started researching this was the Backyard Tennis Club. And this project offered us the perfect opportunity to test our case study and our research into precasting rammed earth. The Backyard Tennis Club is a facility that's put into the Osu neighborhood of Accra for children who are not privileged enough to visit private clubs for tennis training. So the owner of this club basically made this program to support the community and to look at making Ghana's first tennis academy. Ghana is very shortened of public and open social spaces and civic spaces for public gathering. You can kind of see truth to that in this aerial view in Osu, which shows the tennis court here and this mass sprawl of pitched roofs and metal roofing throughout the city with very little open or green space. In researching this tennis court and making a tennis court, because it was the first time we were doing this, we came across a number of images in researching different surfaces for the tennis court, what's the most appropriate surface for it. We came across a number of images that just kept enclosing tennis courts in chain link fence. And that got us thinking into chain link fence just as an enclosure entirely around public spaces that we make outside of Ghana and just in other parts of the world. And where does this knowledge or this use of chain link fence come from? As it wasn't designed specifically for civic spaces. Through research, what we found is that chain link fence was actually produced in 1844 as a post-industrial era way of cheaply deploying enclosures for cattle and to keep cattle enclosed in private properties and also keeping intruders out. And somehow the industrial use of this material has now been gracefully applied to many of our public spaces. And in Ghana, we don't make chain link fence. So once we understood this and realized this challenge ahead of us, we had to really think about what could we do differently for our enclosure around this tennis court. That got us to also thinking about what was traditionally done prior to chain link fencing for enclosing livestock on fields, large fields. And something we found really interesting was that, before the industrialization of this, and even after, people were using and still are using natural materials as a way of enclosing their land or their pastures. So this is somewhere in the west of America that's using timber as an enclosure to keep livestock in. We came across a number of other beautiful references, even from Southern Africa, that uses stone. And so we became fascinated with what happens if we start to look at enclosures or natural enclosures in our own backyard within West Africa. And we came across a number of images. This is from the north of Ghana. Some of you may sort of recognize this typology of dwellings, which are really a bunch of singular rooms that are enclosed with these spanning earth walls, and that connects this into one compound and creates this kind of central courtyard space. This enclosure is obviously to keep your family safe, but it's also to keep predators, night animals that roam away from things that are normally stored in these vessels, like your food and your grain. And so this idea of protection around this enclosure became very interesting to us. Thinking of it as our tennis court in the middle, and then what is it to make an earthen enclosure around that tennis court, rejecting this idea of chain link fencing, which is this kind of generic model of enclosing civic and social spaces, and asking the question, what happens when we turn inward to material that we have locally and that represents the culture that we're building within. We obviously didn't need this rammed earth enclosure to be as solid, as we're not really trying to keep predators out or keep something particularly in. So what we decided to do was look at, well, what happens if we have this rammed earth enclosure and we cut the 65-degree angle into that earth, which creates a level of porosity from the courts to the gardens and from the gardens to the courts. In also being interested in this non-flat and dynamic facade, which is billowing in and around as it creates this enclosure. What happens if we play with geometry on what we call the sacrificial side of the court, which is on the outside? And what happens if we tilt that just 3.5 degrees and create these series of modules, which can be tessellated, modularized, and repeated? We can then precast this off-site, transport them to the tennis court, and then crane them into place. And what this also does is it gives us a kind of dynamic play on light and shadow on the outside, but it creates the smooth, flat surface that we need within for the tennis balls and the tennis players that are training at this facility. What that does is it gives us this 33 rammed earth panel enclosure that sits around the tennis court and these 230 square meters of sustenance gardens on the outside. The rammed earth, they measure 4 meters in height for the larger panels and 2 meters in height on the smaller panels. And they weigh 4 tons and 6 tons respectively. So very mammoth size panels that were produced off site. The 4-meter height that we got to is not an arbitrary number. It's actually thinking through the full life cycle and the logistics of moving these large panels in and around the city. And 4 meters being the longest flatbed that we can get in Ghana to transport these materials. What we can see here is this rammed earth enclosure around the tennis court, and how this porosity brings in elements of its urban context in and around our site. Glimpses of that garden sitting off onto the periphery here on the right-hand side. These panels, again, thinking through the formwork that makes them and understanding that we were also quite cost conscious in this project. We had to design one formwork that was used for all 33 panels. So this formwork was a formwork that was basically assembled and disassembled 33 times in order to create each one of these panels. And this allowed us to create, the way we designed this formwork was also to get the 2-meter height panel as well as the 4-meter height panel, respectively. And realizing that if we wanted really high quality, high precision earth panels that can withstand this commute from where we manufactured it to the site, we really had to invest in ingenious and well-made formwork, which is all made out of wawa board in Ghana, which is a locally procured timber that's lightweight, so that we can have the workers lift and transport these panels and disassemble them. And in craning some of these in place, you'll see some of the panels were also fabricated on site, because in moving them into place, one thing we didn't take into consideration while designing for this entire ecosystem to create these prefabricated earth panels was the crane operator. And that became the biggest disappointment in the entire project, because what we realized is that crane operators need to be very, very skilled in moving 10-ton items and how wind and restraint moves and angles these items into place. So what kept happening, and I don't have a good photo of it, and I regret not taking them because we were devastated when they would break. But we realized post it was actually part of the processes. we would be lifting these 4-meter panels into place, and he would be lowering it, wind would move it too quickly, and it would smash and break into another panel. So quite a learning experience here, but knowing that we were not done with this technology, we really took on board these crane operators and also sent them for training to better suit our next project, actually, which is our next project that we'll share with you. This is just showing you how that porosity, so moving away from a solid rammed earth enclosure and really opening it up to the gardens on the side. Again, just for architectural purposes, that plan of the tennis courts is here. We have 230 square meters of sustenance gardens off to the sides. And then this tennis court is also supported by a series of ancillary structures, toilets, change rooms, storage, etc. For this facility. We can see here, there's the warm-up path where kids can skip rope, run, jog, jumping jacks, and train before coming in to actually hit. And in doing so, being flanked by these sustenance gardens where we have over 32 different species of planting on both sides, and including the periphery. It was really important for us because this was a change in how we see landscapes. So this project was like a multi-point project for us, because this was the first time where we saw that perhaps moving away from landscapes which are ornamental, which we were doing in some of our previous projects, and turning to productive landscapes can actually be a far more interesting way of adorning our spaces and creating more active and live landscapes for the inhabitants. And in this case, it was particularly special for the tennis players, because what happens now is this garden was planted almost a year and a half ago, and it looks completely different now. And our first harvest of bananas, guava, hibiscus is growing, being dried, used for teas, mint, and the kids are harvesting these. So what's really beautiful is this idea of stewardship in the project from the kids and from the caretakers themselves. Just showing you an aerial view of these 32 panels wedged very closely in and around this very dynamic and dense Osu neighborhood. And then the project from the streetscape before we did our intervention along the street, which was the last phase of this project. 7 minutes from this project, a very nice 7-minute walk from this project, comes the last project where we'll talk about rammed earth and its precast and this idea of a sustenance garden. And this project is very dear to me because this project is really less about architecture, and it's actually more about greenery, gardens, and what it means to make a productive and formal gardens within a space where, again, as we said, we're challenged by open public spaces. And for any of you who've been to Ghana, I think you can appreciate that if you ever wanted a park or a garden to go to, it's quite hard to find one, and you otherwise maybe resort to just your front yard or your balcony. The tennis court that we just showed you is here, number 1 on the slide. Number 2, the facade and the project we're going to talk about now is here. And all of this forms what we're currently master planning as the Backyard Urban Campus. And the Backyard Urban Campus is a project where the owner of the tennis court and the owner of this gardens is ultimately buying vacant plots in and around the neighborhood to make this campus in this very dense inner part of Accra to really form Ghana's first tennis academy and West Africa's first tennis academy. Subsequently, since making this diagram, we also received word that they've just took over a sale of this building, which is abandoned on the left-hand side of us, to expand the number of tennis courts. We also have administration buildings that we're planning for, which is in an adaptive reuse building. And additionally, on a vacant site, a 5-story training facility for the tennis players outside of training on the court. But again, this is kind of just showing you how this all fits into this larger campus, but the project we'll be focusing on is this backyard playground and gardens. And I think one of the things that, you know, we for anyone, again, who's been to Accra, just to explain our city a little bit to you, Accra contains a variety of, you know, different and isolated public spaces, a variety of different parks and gardens that are very different for social, recreational, educational, and even environmental purposes, as with the Achimota forests. However, these functions, they're often concentrated in particular spaces rather than deliberately being integrated into one holistic landscape. So you can go to the children's park and take your child, or even you as an adult, and go for play. However, there is no productive or educational quality to this park. You have the large forest in the heart of Accra, which is the Achimota Forest or Achimota Park, which is peppered with signs to keep off. While this is very good for the environment, there are very little planned leisure spaces or play spaces within here. While we have the botanical gardens again, which is educational and speaks to explaining a number of and varieties of different native vegetations to Ghana, there is no active sort of social space. And again, dotted in and around Accra, you have these fields, and these agricultural fields, which actually became the essence of the project. As we became really fascinated with these grids and how these grids also sit on the fringe of sometimes dense urban communities, but also sometimes these open and wild landscapes. So again, becoming really fascinated with these grids, we're really interested in studying how these productive landscapes and these agricultural fields can inform the garden project. And what does it mean to make a garden that encapsulates all of these different elements within a dense urban environment? So looking at it, we were looking at this agricultural space planning and what does this kind of patchwork of grids mean? How could it be applied to a more tight site? And what does these organizational principles mean for organizing primary circulation, secondary circulation for caring for these different planting beds, creating pockets of different social activities, and then also organizing the planting beds of the various species of either crops or productive plantings that would happen within the site. And that led us to this kind of concept plan where we had a cafe that makes use of everything that's grown on the site, along with pockets for play, education, contemplation, and leisure. That takes us to the site plan showing this active and this educational garden and this productive garden within this, again, dense urban environment with the tennis court just sitting just behind here, out of view. The plan of it is that we needed a series of ancillary structures to support the use of this as a garden. So a series of very practical and pragmatic things like toilets and storage and security, the boring things really, but necessities to making a park a usable space for this community. A series of planting beds where you come in and you discover the kind of contemplative gardens. You have the leisure gardens, forming all of here. You have the education gardens, the play gardens, and then this cafe at the back, which makes use of all of these productive planting beds within the project. Just to sort of illustrate and break down these different elements, you have the educative gardens, which is characterized by a series of planting beds, which will be made with seasonal crops, with this kind of U-shaped seating for kids and a dedicated horticulturist, which will be on site tending to the greenery, but also educating kids and local school groups as to the different plantings. And I'll tell a funny story how we actually got to this project. At the beginning of it, and why we thought education was really important for this, we're sitting down with our team and trying to understand, like, what do we do for making a garden and moving away from this idea of this vast green lawn. And in doing so, there's this young lady who I won't name as this is being live streamed, but she was having her breakfast, and every morning she ate this traditional Ghanaian breakfast meal, which is an egg with onions inside. And we're just having this conversation about, what it means to make these landscapes and, making jokes about this egg that she eats every morning with onions. And she made a joke that, by the time she's finished eating these eggs, she'll be hanging from a tree. And so we had to ask, do you think onions grow on trees? And to which she answered yes. And so we were shocked by this answer. And I thought at that point that, and she's much younger, in her early 20s. And we thought that, let's use this garden as an educational purpose, to really educate kids who really lose sight of where things are grown and how they're grown, where they come from. And we thought that that was a really important element to bring in. Contemplation as well was really important, to create spaces where one can retreat from this very bustling, dynamic neighborhood. And creating this only space where we have a lawn in the project. And this lawn is really meant to be a space where one can lay down and just kind of engulf this water feature being shaded also, because as our sun direction comes from here, it also acts as shading. So one can really lay down in this field, and divorce themselves from the everyday life for just a moment. We have leisure, which is characterized by a series of in situ elements built into the boundary walls for social gathering. Also exploring back traditional ways of play within the ground. It's to be said that the ground of this entire surface, which you'll see through some of the visuals, is all palm kernel shells. We've moved away from having large, vast green fields as the lawns for these projects. And if anyone is aware of the game Owari, Owari is currently played in these wooden boxes with these shells and these carved holes. But traditionally, Owari is actually played in the floor and carved out of the ground. So we wanted to really explore these traditional ways of play and leisure within this gardens and really bring them back to the forefront of our contemporary society. And lastly, working on play as a dedicated element, where we're working with a Nigerian industrial designer on combining different forms of West African play into this multi-playscape, moving away from the inherited ones that we typically see, which is a slide, maybe some, crossbars and, a swing, a tire swing and things like that. So we were less intrigued by importing one of these playscapes and what would it be to create one from scratch that really referenced and paid homage to traditional West African play. Again, just as this is an architecture lecture, we'll talk about architecture. The panels at the front, again, are these rammed earth panels, significantly smaller in size, just given the programmatic requirements of the project. It uses, and I think it's a nice way to end the lecture, because it uses also this pozzolana concrete as a base to keep the rammed earth, for technical reasons, off of the ground for erosion purposes. And while these ancillary structures graces the perimeter or the boundary between the streetscape or the public domain and this private gardens towards the end, what we wanted to do was really find a way to bring the notion of the gardens to the foreground. So we made this forecourt, which allows us to bring some of this productive planting to the front of the project, avoiding the necessity for signage. And actually what you can see is a very porous entrance, which would lead one naturally into the interiors to face these, this contemplative garden. This contemplative garden, again, is characterized by this overhanging canopy, which during the rainy season allows us to collect water into a dedicated trough, which is then channeled into a underground water tank, which is used to irrigate the landscapes during the dry season. Otherwise, it's home to just a natural cyclical water feature, which allows one to divorce and kind of drown out the sound of this loud street in front of us, Loco Road, which is always bustling with taxi horns and food calls and bars and loud music. So by using the sound of water, we can actually drain out that and disconnect one momentarily from the city as a contemplative garden. We have these leisure gardens again, where this built-in furniture is all along the periphery wall. This game of Owari carved into the ground. And again, you can see in this project where we dismiss the notion of using a large green carpet field as a field for the landscape, but rather turning to this waste valorization of using palm kernel shells as the base. And what that does is it allows us to also create a very permeable surface for this landscape, and where we have French drains underneath that collect this groundwater and again channel them into these underground tanks for irrigation. So we rely less and less on the municipal water supply to this area, which only comes 2 times a week. So these sustainable strategies were also very important to us in this project. We then get to the rear of the site where we have this, this cafe pavilion at the rear with this large porch, which allows people to gather, use it for Wi-Fi, work, congregate, and use leisurely. We can see here in the foreground this educative garden where we would grow seasonal crops and have this dedicated horticulturist educating children on different types of productive landscapes, along with this indicative and not designed by the industrial designer playscape in this play area. And it's only in this area where we change the flooring of the material, as the palm kernel shells, if a child falls, can perhaps bruise them. So looking for something that's a little bit softer for the kids that would occupy this playscape and this garden space. And ultimately a model, a concept model for this project that we built to kind of study it. And just bringing us to the end, I just wanted to end with a quote by Stuart Hall again in the same passage, which says, "People have to have a language to speak about where they are and what other possible futures are available to them. And for us, Future Lineages is part of building that language." Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. I think that many of us can resonate with how you begin to think about architectural futures on this continent. And what many of you might not have known is that this is actually a hybrid lecture. So there are another crowd of people watching online. It's the second lecture in our collaboration with RIBA Africa. The first lecture was a British practice presenting to us here, and this lecture by Glenn is being presented by 2 people in the UK. And so on behalf of RIBA Africa, we're going to ask Nenpin just to give a brief response, and then we'll open for questions. So you've got a minute or 2 to kind of formulate your questions.
Right. Good evening, everyone, and to the people online as well. Thank you very much, Glenn. I'll start there for another collaboration. Thank you, Glenn, for your presentation. RIBA Africa, this is our initiative to sort of establish a chapter of what we like to understand as architectural excellence on the continent. But much in sort of the ethos in what Glenn's lecture was, you know, we also understand that knowledge is not unidirectional. So it's very well placed to have you in your projects. And I think there's a lot that you showed us today. I tried to distill it in a few words. But I think I very much like the fact that you started out with an ethos, with the Stuart Hall quote, and you also ended with one. And I see you entering a conversation at a very relevant time, but very grounded in sort of understanding the context in which you are coming into. But using architecture, retaining your agency, and also creating this new language, which is quite relevant, rooted in material research, rooted in community, not devoid of the realities of the context in which you are operating in, but also a very, very clear language and the use of architecture. So I'm hoping that is sort of the knowledge that then propagates back, because as much as you talk about extending the language, I think you regenerate it before you actually extend it, and you do it very well. So I'm hoping to sort of the audience, the primary audience here in the room, which I believe are the architecture students, but indeed to the audience who's online as a way of a knowledge exchange, which is something we hope that we're establishing with this initiative that we are undertaking. But yeah, I think if I were to encapsulate your whole presentation, which by no means is reducing it, because oftentimes we suffer the flattening of what is African architecture, indeed the word Africa. But I think community stands out for me, materiality, and sort of agency. But it rooted in research is sort of something that captures the substance of what is culture and identity and being responsive to the people. So I think if I might have done a bit of justice to that. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We thought Glenn might need to sit after a very long day. So we are going to send a mic around. What one can I give you this mic to send around? And for questions. So please raise your hand and it's coming to you.
Thank you. Fantastic. Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's good.
Hi again, welcome to South Africa.
Thank you.
So the Green Design. I think the question would be based from your presentation, and thank you so much for that. How do you define sustainability in the African context? Because I think a lot of the time we look at it from, decarbonization, but I'd love to hear your thoughts around materiality and sustainability and how we should maybe be reconstructing how we define that.
Yeah.
And it's nice to see you again.
Nice to see you as well. I think sustainability, at least the way we try to practice it in the studio, is not really looking outward towards the checklist that we're all familiar with in practice, from BREEAM, from EDGE. We really try to really come up with our own ways and means within the resources available to us to make an impact in reducing that carbon emission or embodied carbon in the projects that we work on. Now, where you take that in the life cycle of a project is obviously really important to denoting what is sustainable and what is not. If we are, and this is something we grapple in the studio regularly, is if we are putting, a certain amount of diesel in a truck to send it 30 kilometers away to get the right laterite to bring back to the capital city, where does the sustainability in that lie as these trucks are pumping diesel and these fuel emissions into the air? So I don't know that I have an answer directly as to what sustainability really means per se, because where we take that in the life cycle of a project is very, it could debunk anyone's answer really. But I think what's really important is to understand what the complexities are in our built environment, to understand what materials are, in some ways regenerative, in some ways sort of carbon free, if you want to call it. For instance, we work quite frequently with, and being very specific about them when you know them and being very anchored in your principles. For instance, the timber we source is only timber from the bed of Lake Volta, which, for anyone that doesn't know, the Volta Lake is, I think, the largest man-made lake by volume. And in creating that lake, what happened was there are a series of mature trees in this valley, and they dammed and made this lake and basically had all these submerged trees for over 80 years. Now, what kept happening on the Volta Lake is it's an active fishing ground for the fishing community of this eastern region part of Ghana. Is when the tide levels or the water would drop levels, boats would come in contact with these trees and fishermen would drown, basically, because these fishermen also didn't know how to swim. So the government and a private institution started this initiative where they have geotagged all of these various species of trees which are living and have been preserved underneath this lake. and ultimately allows us to go in and harvest them. So supplying timber to our projects, but not adding to the deforestation and the negative effects of that. So we try in our own small ways to contribute to that. We try to keep a register of what's applicable and what's not applicable. If we were to follow that checklist, we'd be making bicycle racks for people who don't ride bikes, just to get those points. And I think it's really important to kind of move away from that and really look at what are the principles, what you can achieve in your own backyard, and do the most you can and be as principled as you can with it. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
I've never spoken on a mic before, so hi Glenn.
Hello. Hello.
Where do you see the future of this materiality move towards in an African context as a whole?
Yeah. I don't know that I'm so engaged in necessarily understanding like the far future, but in the near future, and in where we're working and the impact we want to have, what we're really hoping to do through the material studies and the systems that we're creating is we're looking to hopefully bring this materiality, if not through my generation, through the generation and the team that I work with, back into the regular cycle of building materials that's used. This shift from earth construction to timber construction in Ghana to now cinder block, was all done within a 100-year span, right? And what we hope to do by solving some of these pragmatic issues as we push these products quite a lot, and I mean, I didn't show these projects, but we really push these material studies onto developers who are really against this idea because, and where this study even started from was us promoting rammed earth to a developer. And the idea was that, it would take the project far too long, cost too much money, and he would have no ROI or return on investment for his project. And that's what led us to the kind of study on precast. And if we could precast this and solve that issue for a developer, perhaps we can start getting these materials back into the regular cycle of building materials that we can use. And what we've noticed also, which has been really cute and kind of ironic, is that we put these things up and they look foreign to the people who we are building in the communities of. And what's really interesting is that you go back and you find that someone might have gotten orange paint to paint their building a similar color because something resonates with them and the hue of earth. Or they may do the same thing with this kind of tan sand color from the Pozo. And, they haven't opted for building with rammed earth yet, but it's a step in the right direction, I think. And what we're hoping for is to create this module or this idea that, it can kind of permeate back into the building cycle. So materiality, there's only so much we can really do, but really what we're super interested in is really augmenting the systems of what the supply chain offers and getting this materiality into those systems as a way of really making a more profound change.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, Glenn.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Something that came up for me was the topic and theme of leisure within a lot of your projects, attending to the people within Ghana. As leisure has become a huge part of the projects that you've been a part of in the design process, and something that resonates quite prominently within my own projects at the GSA, speaking about leisure and people. So to help me, my question is, to what extent do you think leisure can be stretched out from a spatial experience alongside the architecture that you've designed within our present day and future? And then an additional, then on top of that question, almost what's that next leisure step for you that you could foresee in the next projects that you aim to make, whether it's in Ghana or in other regions?
I might have to ask you to repeat the first question, but I'll start with the second one. Let me answer that one while it's in mind. I don't know that we directly set out to create leisure. I should really be honest in that. This idea of leisure really comes from our clients, this demand for leisure. So tennis as leisure is not really just to create a tennis court, but it's really to build into this larger infrastructure of someone who wants to champion the training and providing the facilities to make Ghana's next, hopefully either WTA or ATP champion one day for anyone who plays tennis. So the idea of leisure really came about from the brief of the client. But what we try to do when given that brief, and any brief for that matter, is really try to make spaces within our architecture that allows it to break away from the sort of quintessential programming, a bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchen. Because I think that for me, I designed from the perspective of myself, I would really like to be in spaces where I can break off from those kind of sort of regular programs to, just think, be, create. And I think that that's often what we're doing. I mean, with the gardens as well, leisure really came from the client's brief as he really started with wanting to make this a private park for his son. And, we really pushed back on that and thought that for you, and I think as an architect, you sometimes have to be very vocal when you think things are not correct. And when you think a singular project can actually have a much more profound impact if it was more accessible to a greater community. And luckily for us, we work with people who actually listen and we negotiate with. So this turned from a private park and gardens for his children to being a more public, open-facing facility. And in that, what we looked for is what is either created in these solo or in these silos, and how can we bring them all together? And if you ever came or if you've been to Accra, leisure is something that's everywhere around us. It's in the streets, formally, informally, however you want to classify that. It's in every home, it's in the courtyard housing, it's everywhere around us. So one thing I'd say is, in Ghana, we know leisure well. So because of that, we definitely want to create that in a lot of our projects and try to in many instances. Sorry.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Mhm.
One last and then one right at the back.
Hi, Glenn. Thank you for that incredible presentation. I think there is a very deep sensitivity and intelligence to the work that you presented to us. And I think it functions, the sustainability aspect of it functions just more than, it functions beyond the material and what you're doing. I think it was a very refreshing presentation to help us sort of also challenge the conventions we use when we're constructing buildings and question, why do we use certain materials and why do we use them in a particular way? I had a question more around, I'm not sure if it's something that you started with or started thinking about, but in the first slide that you showed us where you're doing different work, has there been any projects outside of Ghana where you've tried to apply the same principles of sustainability or material experimentation? And has there been any sort of insights from that? I'm not sure if that's something that you've already encountered.
Yeah, we actively have. We did a project in London, which was installation for an artist, where we recreated the courtyard of his home in the gallery at a 1-to-1 scale because he was tired of putting his works on white walls. And obviously through going through the design process and visiting this ancestral courtyard for him and seeing how the family who still lives there uses that courtyard, Cooking was one of the primary functions there. So that then led us to a series of design moves where we ended up charring the entire structure. And we got so fixated on this idea of building this Ghanaian courtyard at a one-to-one scale of burnt wood in Ghana and shipping to the UK that we lost sight of all aspects of sustainability, to be honest with you. And it was the client who, funnily enough, brought our own ethos back to us when we were fighting for this and said, but isn't it your job to be sustainable? What's sustainable about trucking all these or creating all of these, either by plane or ship? So we had to let go of that narrative, basically. And what we did was we had to find a way to get creative and to bring this, because I told you earlier, we like to source our wood from this one place. And so it forced us into this research that we had to do on, engineered and fast growing timber in the UK, which led us to this Akoya wood. And the Akoya wood having these magnificent and sustainability properties in terms of regrowth, regeneration, and what it takes to actually grow this timber. And that's one place how we had to kind of use that thinking, I guess, to satisfy the ethos of like what is important to the studio. Again, in LA, another project, we were really set on a specific kind of wood from Canada. Trump came in with tariffs. It threw the entire project budget out through the roof because there was tariffs on Canadian wood coming in. And again, I always find these opportunities as ways to reset us and stop being so fixated on a particular thing and really looking at the narrative from a more, shall I say, macro perspective. And that led us to really looking at and, utilizing, it changed the design aesthetic, but I think it's sometimes important not to necessarily be so committed to the end result and the aesthetic, but be more committed to the process. And so what it resulted in was us using locally made plywood, locally made 2x4s, and the design took a completely different turn by being restricted, one, by these ridiculous tariffs, and secondly, but those tariffs and that ridiculousness actually became a blessing in disguise. So what it's done is it's kind of reset us, and both projects were happening around the same time, but so we kind of now try to look at projects from a more macro perspective and understanding what we can do to stay true to this ideology of being sustainable, sourcing sustainably, and applying these principles locally where applicable. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
One last question there at the back.
Hi.
Hello.
My question is based on function and form. And I just want to emphasize that in terms of form, as someone who's stepping into a sustainability unit, I did appreciate that. And I'm just wondering, there's a section that I saw of a woman walking by, right? And I'm just thinking, in terms of function, when I saw that, I was imagining the ball just hitting the woman.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to know, in terms of function, what did you notice that was successful and was not successful after the entire project?
I think I know what you're alluding to. It was one of the biggest critiques, and I think, the thing is that we don't really show a lot of, the tennis court would have been a lecture in itself, but I thought it was more important to show you this broader perspective of the practice and the materials that we are engaged in. But first off, let me just say that the kids that come to play here are top notch. I play tennis, my wife plays tennis, and we can't beat these kids. So they are really not hitting the ball out of this court to hit people. Additionally, where do I start? Okay, did you see that the back wall of the tennis court has a high wall and then the panels sit on top? Yeah, so that 2 meter high solid wall is there because what we started with was the 4 meter high panels everywhere. But we had to introduce this 2 meter high wall because that's where, through all of our studies and using a physicist with us, to really project where the balls were going, it was bouncing within a 2-meter height range when the kids were hitting it out. So all of this was tracked data that we were using and simulating in order to understand where the height of that wall needed to be and what the leftover of it could have been in rammed earth. Additionally, on the oblique, on the long facades where you have 4 meters, the reason why the panels are the thickness that they are, because rammed earth doesn't have to be 0.5 meter thick. But the reason our panels are 0.5 meter thick is because it's the ricochet action. So what happens is when the ball hits the long facade that's full height and has the more porosity, what happens is because the ball is hitting it on this trajectory, it ricochets, or it hits the wall and bounces in, or it ricochets within and bounces back into the court. So what was really interesting about studying this was also the study on reduction, right? Like we didn't have to build solid walls to keep the ball in, but just through technology and simulation, we can actually predict where that ball was going and lighten the mass of these rammed earth walls. Lighten it in one way, but also have to thicken it in order to make sure that it did what we saw in the studies. And there are a series of fascinating studies that we have that maybe on the day that I make this into a lecture on its own, I will share with everyone because it's quite fascinating to see the simulations and show how the ball ricochets and stays in. So don't get me wrong, just like with chain link fence, if you hit the ball recklessly, the ball is going out of the court. So I don't want to say that that's not a possibility. It totally is. But for the players and the people that are playing there and for the way we've designed it, that happens very infrequently. But the community, you know, they're lovers of the court, they're lovers of this idea. So by the time that ball is out, someone's throwing it back in for us anyhow. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Glenn, and on behalf of everybody else online, thank you very much for your lecture today. After a long day of unit reviews, and I'm noticing a number of practitioners in the audience who I'm sure are also going to be thinking about what we need to do here to change our supply chain and perhaps move away from green and lean. So thank you very much.
Thank you very
and
much.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.